Hello, my name is Alan Journet, and I am a co-facilitator of Southern Oregon Climate Action Now. I would like to welcome you to our trial run of SOCAN general meetings via Zoom and Facebook. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this evening. We hope it's a success. We would like you very much to let us know after the event how satisfying it was for you, so we know whether we should continue doing this or try something different as we go through the months. Our plan, since we are starting today with this Zoom Facebook arrangement, is to have further meetings as we go forward whilst the lockdown is still going on, at least for those of us who are sane. So we would like you to let us know how the experience was for you. And you can do that by sending an email to me, alan@socan.eco, or to kathy@socan.eco. Please let us know after the program is over how successful it was for you. As you can see, what we're going to be doing today is discussing a theme that we actually had for our March program, which we had to shelve. And luckily, Pam, Marsh, and Jeff Gordon agreed to come back with us now and join us to discuss Oregon climate action. Where are we and where do we go from here? So, welcome on behalf of SOCAN. One of the things that we usually do at our meetings, if you've attended our meetings regularly, well, you will know, we have a moment at the beginning of the program where we ask people to pair up and share a question. And so we give people normally 60 minutes either way. Well, what we're going to do today is ask you to think for a moment. We have a couple of questions. The first question we'd like you to think about is what happened to meaningful greenhouse gas legislation during the Oregon 2020 legislative session? And the second one, what is it you have heard about Governor Kate Brown's Executive Order 2004? And as we go through the program, with a bit of luck, we'll answer these questions amongst others. The format for the meeting is we start off with presentations. We will then have a Q&A. We're not sure how long that's going to be, but that will take us through up until about the last 15 to 20 minutes. If you have a question, please write it in the Facebook comments segment. And if you are directing your question to a specific presenter, please identify that as you write your question. And once we've gone through the Q&A on the basic presentations, Kathy will come in and give you a summary of SOCAN activities. We haven't been asleep during the COVID crisis. We have been meeting and doing things. So Kathy's going to catch you up on all of that towards the end of the program. So once again, let me thank you for joining us. The program is going to be focused on, I'm going to do some of the talking. Caren Caldwell has generously agreed to come and do some of the talking as well. And then we'll have a segment where Pam Marsh and Jeff Gordon will give you their perspectives from the legislature on the question that we're posing and trying to address today. So this is the outline of the specific presentation segment. We're going to start with a quickie on what happened in 2020. We're going to follow that with Caren and I will go through the various components of the executive order and give you a very quick summary of the various things that that executive order is attempting to do. I'll come back after that and do a very quick discussion of what's missing from Executive Order 2004, which particularly will compare it to Senate Bill 1530. And then I'll talk very quickly about how we might engage in the executive order rulemaking, because that's the biggie that's coming right up. And then we'll go to a discussion with Pam and Jeff on views from the Oregon House and the Oregon Senate, followed by Q&A. And again, write your questions as they come up into Facebook in the comment section. So let's start with a quick summary of what happened in 2020. And anybody who was paying attention to what was happening legislatively in 2020 probably knows all of this. I'm probably not going to be giving you anything you don't already know. So you might recall that we had introduced into the legislature a bill called Senate Bill 1530. Didn't have a title, but it was a cap, trade, and invest bill. It was designed to cap emissions on a reducing trend. Folks could trade their allowances, and then we generated some funds which were invested. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks before the end of the session, and Pam and Jeff can no doubt fill us in more a bit later on the details of this if they decide to, the Republicans walked out and they thwarted action not only on this bill, but on 40 other proposals which were under discussion in the legislature. And here's a quick example of some of those proposals. This was an array of many bipartisan proposals that could have benefited large segments of the Oregon society. Unfortunately, all of these proposals were negated, thwarted, because the Republicans walked out. And then, because the governor had committed quite heavily that 2020 would be the year of climate action, she, on March the 10th, signed Executive Order 2004. And now we're going to talk about Executive Order 2004. What the executive order did was charge a number of agencies, and there's about 16 of them listed here. And when I looked at this list, initially I thought, well, gosh darn it, that seems like it's got to be all of the agencies in Oregon. Well, actually, no. There are 125 various agencies and boards and commissions in Oregon. And so the governor's executive order didn't actually influence many of those agencies. These are the key 16 that were mentioned. The plan that is being generated as a result of Executive Order 2004 has come to be known as the Oregon Climate Action Plan, or OCAP. Sounds a bit Irish, doesn't it? OCAP, but that's what we are tending to call it. The Oregon Climate Action Plan specified certain goals in terms of the limiting of greenhouse gases. And like Senate Bill 1530 and previous bills that have gone through the legislature, the focus is on 1990 as the baseline. And so the goals in the executive order are by 2035, we should be 45% below 1990 greenhouse gas emissions. And then by 2050, we should be 80% below 1990 emissions. State agencies were then charged with exercising their authority and discretion to further achievement of these goals. And I'll come back to what the agencies are doing at the end of this segment of the presentation. They're targeted to achieve these goals in a cost-effective manner, and also to do it while prioritizing actions that help vulnerable populations and impacted communities. And when we start talking about specific elements of the proposal, a bit later on, Caren will talk a little more about that element. Agencies were required to report on their proposed actions by May the 15th. And these are the agencies that were supposed to do that by May the 15th. Again, I'll come back to this one a bit later on. And then an interagency work group was established composed of these agencies and boards, and that was designed to work on the climate impacts to impacted communities to ensure social justice was embedded in the Oregon Climate Action Plan. So the first element in OCAP is a cap and reduce emissions from 1990 levels. There are elements that are contained within this segment of the proposal dealt with large station resources. Utilities are currently responsible for 26% of our statewide emissions, industry 6.5%. And under the heading large station resources, the Public Utilities Commission is charged with promoting decarbonization and greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and also promoting electrification of our state infrastructure. Transportation fuels are about 40% of our emissions, particularly gasoline and diesel, and these are being charged with reducing their emissions also. And in addition to gasoline and diesel, other liquid and gaseous fuels are also being expected under this cap and reduce component to reduce emissions according to the state trajectory. So what that means is those large stationary sources are going to have to be reducing on the trajectory to 45% below 1990 by 2035 and 80% below by 2050. Transportation, which, as I mentioned, is 40% of our emissions. There are two elements within transportation which are contained within the OCAP. One deals with clean fuel standards. If you were around in 2015, you might recall that the state legislature passed a clean fuel standards program. And what that did was require that transportation fuels should exhibit a reduction in the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted per unit of energy generated by their combustion to 10% below the previous level by 2025. There is also, under the transportation category, there are also going to be clean fuel credits for electrification of our transportation system. So under the clean fuel standards, we're going to be going more severe. So rather than the 10% by 2025, that has been elevated to a 20% reduction by 2025, and then a 25% reduction by 2035. Under the clean fuel credits for electrification, we have a goal of stimulating the purchase of electric vehicles in Oregon. Currently, there are about 32,000 electric vehicles on our highways. By 2020, this should rise to 50,000. By 2025, to some 250,000. And that's going to be stimulated by incentives and so forth. In addition, by 2030, under this category, 25% of registered vehicles in Oregon should be electric vehicles, and that should include 50% of new vehicles. The Environmental Quality Commission and the Department of Environmental Quality are charged with generating methods for achieving these goals. And that element I'll come back to when we get into how do we get involved. In terms of food waste, it turns out that food waste is rather a large component of our greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, all of that food that goes into the composting pile, a good thing to do with waste food, but it decays and results in emissions. So it turns out that there's about 2.6% of the total emissions in the United States are a result of food waste. I'm not sure what the data are specific for Oregon, but I'm guessing it's pretty typical of the country as a whole. So the goal is to reduce that by 2030 by 50%. And this is going to be undertaken by a combination of education, incentives, and regulation. And I'll pause for a moment and note that one of the underlying principles throughout the executive order is it's not all regulation. It involves education, incentives, and regulation to the extent that the first two elements don't actually achieve the goals. Another element is landfill methane emissions. And what the executive order does is require that the state shall align its standards for landfill methane emissions with the most stringent standards in any state bordering Oregon. Buildings, as you probably know, are a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, and the effort here is going to be to increase the energy efficiency in both residential and commercial buildings. So by 2030, there should be a 60% reduction in the annual energy consumption of any new buildings constructed. In addition, the Building Codes Division of the Department of Consumer and Business Services shall, with the Oregon Department of Energy, develop an evaluation mechanism over the next 3 cycles that will allow them to update what are called REACH codes. And these are codes which promote improved construction standards and performance efficiency over the minimum required by the codes. In terms of our lands, there are expectations that we're going to increase our capacity in our natural and working lands in the state of Oregon. We're going to increase their capacity to extract and store carbon from the atmosphere. This is a process called carbon sequestration, and the Oregon Global Warming Commission is charged with proposing goals for carbon sequestration for natural and working lands. This is going to include forests and agriculture across the state. And the last one that I'm going to address, I think, is innovation. The Oregon Climate Action Plan is promoting industrial greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The State Environmental Quality Commission will encourage innovation through, again, incentivizing adoption of new technologies and processes. And now I hand the ball over to Caren, who will work through a few more of the elements of the Oregon Climate Action Program. Over to you, Caren.
Thank you. So continuing from where Alan left off, the next category of activities in the executive order is clean energy. And that is especially in regards to public utilities. And clean energy and utilities, am I echoing? Okay. Clean energy and utilities matters because electricity is the second largest contributor to climate pollution in Oregon, next to transportation. So the OCAP, the Oregon Climate Action Plan, stipulates that Oregon's way of regulating utilities must be based not only on power needs and affordability, but also here on out on climate health. Next. To accomplish that, OCAP requires that the Public Utility Commission do 4 things in particular, more than that, but 4 basic things. One is reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the utility sector. 2 is to increase renewable energy and energy efficiencies, conservation. 3rd is to diversify our energy supply. And that includes encouraging private and public electric companies to support the electrification of our transportation system. And 4th is to evaluate and to train electric companies to produce wildfire protection plans. Next. OCAP also requires the Oregon Department of Energy to update energy efficiency standards for consumer products, also like the methane in landfill, to the most stringent standards currently in use among the West Coast states. Next. The benefits we hope to gain from this work within the utility sector is to create more jobs in clean transportation, in construction, in energy efficiency, and other ways of greening up our economy, to provide cleaner air and healthier communities for our state. Next. Now, the next few categories take us from specific climate actions to wider concerns that are places in our economy and our society which are impacted by climate change. And first among these categories is public health. Public health has a lot of impacts from climate, so that's why this one matters. So there's air pollution that increases because of climate change. That increases rates of asthma, lung, and heart disease, and we're seeing those rates go up right now. Also extreme heat, which leads to dehydration and other illnesses as well. And then, of course, wildfires, which produces not only physical harm, but psychological trauma as well. Next. OCAP requires, in order to promote Public Health that the Oregon Health Authority produce an annual report on the public health impacts of climate change, especially regarding those health risks that are faced by vulnerable populations, i.e. seniors, children, low-income communities, communities of color, tribes, and rural communities. The first report must be delivered to the governor by September of this year, 2020. Next. OCAP also requires the Oregon Health Authority, working with the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to propose standards to protect outdoor workers from extreme heat, wildfire smoke, and other climate impacts. Those proposals must be complete by June 30 of next year, 2021. Now, this is also an activity, this promotion of standards, that's supposed to work with the commitment made in our Oregon state budget of tackling wildfire risks. Next. Basically, the benefits from this project in regarding our public health is that we get the data and we get standards on which to base public health and climate decisions going forward. Next. Our next concern is climate's impact on our youth. And that matters very much because young people are increasingly anxious and depressed about the dire effects of climate change on their futures. OCAP is going to require the Oregon Health Authority once again to conduct a study on the impacts of climate change on youth depression and mental health. That study also needs to be complete by June 30 of next year. The benefits provided by doing this study are meant to be an understanding of the situation that youth are in because of climate change and how they respond to that. And I suppose I could conjecture that that study will give us guidance for creating priorities that will affect our Oregon youth in a positive way. Next. Finally, and perhaps, at least in my mind, the most important lens for viewing the impacts of climate change is social justice, or also called environmental justice. Climate really matters in issues of equity. And that's because climate change has a pronounced and disproportionate effect on specific impacted communities. Those communities include Native American tribes, communities of color, rural communities, low-income communities, and other unrepresented communities. Now, both the direct effects of climate change and our efforts also to mitigate and adapt to climate change are already resulting in worsening conditions for these disproportionately impacted communities. And that includes in terms of their physical health, mental health, financial resources, and cultural well-being. Next. So in order to accomplish this goal, OCAP requires the governor's office, as Alan said, to convene an interagency work group to focus on these communities and the climate impacts brought to bear on them. And it also requires state agencies to do two things. One, this is for all the state agencies, especially the 16 ones mentioned in the executive order, is to prioritize actions that help impacted communities adapt to climate changes. And two, to do some of that work or much of their work consulting with the Environmental Justice Task Force. That's a group that was founded by the state legislature to work on climate mitigation and adaptation priorities. This is a task force that is made up of members from these diverse communities. Next. OCAP also requires the Public Utility Commission, also in cooperation with the Oregon Housing and Community Services, to consider and to mitigate the energy burden that communities face from utilities. That energy burden means the percent of a person's income spent on electricity, heating, and transportation. So this goal needs to be examined What is that energy burden across different populations in the state, to mitigate those and other inequalities, and to examine utility rate designs for standards of equity as well. Next. OCAP's requirements were originally meant to go along with commitments already placed into our Oregon budget. That includes environmental justice work and the creation of a just transition fund to train workers for good paying jobs in the growing clean energy economy that we want to create. And it was going along all right until, of course, the pandemic hit, and now we have to make large cuts in our budget to adjust for the COVID-19 impacts on our resources in our state. Next. Still, the benefits we hope for are that getting impacted communities engaged in our statewide policymaking process will ensure that we can reach equitable solutions to achieve Oregon's climate objectives. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Caren. What I'm going to do now is just a few words about what's missing from the executive order that was present in Senate Bill 1530. And of course, this is something that Pam and Jeff, when he joins us, can expand on if they wish to. The first point to note is that Senate Bill 1530 was really based on the idea that major polluters would be buying allowances to pollute at an auction. Unfortunately, the governor does not have the capacity to impose on the people of Oregon anything that raises taxes or raises revenue. So an auction was not an option. However, I was on a conference call today with DEQ, and they were pointing out that it is quite possible that under the program that they're developing, there will still be compliance instruments, sort of allowances, that they would disperse to major polluters, and those allowances would be reduced, and then entities that polluted, who managed to pollute less than the number of allowances they got, could trade those on the open market. One of the key elements in Senate Bill 1530 was the generation of a fund that could be used to invest in various critical issues. In particular, in relation to the points that Caren was making regarding equity, one of the major components of the investment was to invest in impacted communities. 10% was going to go to tribes and other impacted communities, including rural Oregon. So unfortunately, because the Senate Bill 1530 was thwarted, there are now no direct investments generated from the program to reduce emissions. And so many of the benefits that would have accrued to communities in Oregon are now unfortunately not readily available. At the time that the governor signed the executive order, she made a budgetary commitment that she would compensate for the fact that there were no funds being generated for investment in her future budgets. But again, as Caren just pointed out, COVID struck. So the signing of the executive order was March 10th. And if you remember, things really got bad towards the end of March. And since then, we've had a serious problem with our budget. So now the question is, how do we get involved in the rulemaking? Because what we have is from the governor, an executive order, which is about 14 pages long, and in large measure, as we have just gone through, you can see, essentially establishes a series of goals and ways that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions or capture and sequester them. But the question really now is, what do we do? Well, what we have to do if we are concerned about promoting climate action in Oregon is get involved in the rulemaking as much as we possibly can. I mentioned earlier that agencies were charged with the task of developing by May the 15th a proposal on how they were going to go and move forward through the process of generating means to achieve the objectives of the executive order. As of May the 23rd, when I was on, the website, these are the agencies that had already submitted their proposals. The ones in blue, if you go to the web page at the top, and we'll give you this at the end, you can get it from our SOCAN website. If you go to the page, you can see exactly which agencies have submitted their proposals and which have not. And you can see that Agriculture, Watershed Enhancement Board, and Administrative Services have, at that stage at least, hadn't. I haven't checked the page lately to see if they're in. It's very, very important, and I will stress this, for those of us who live in rural Oregon to engage in this process. The reason that that is critical is because those who oppose action on climate in Oregon have portrayed, as you will probably know if you've been following activities over the last couple of years, have portrayed the efforts to establish a climate action plan in Oregon. They've portrayed that as a case of urban Oregon, urban Oregon, particularly Portland, trying to impose its will on the rest of Oregon. But as those of us who live in rural Oregon know, that's not the case. We know what climate change is doing in rural Oregon. We know that we need to do something to address it. We know that that's a primary factor influencing our forests. So those of us who live in rural Oregon have a particular responsibility, it seems to me, to get involved as much as we can. And what we're asking you to do, or going to be asking you to do as we get to the end of the program, is try and get involved as much as you can. We're going to be trying to do that ourselves, and we would like as much help from other rural Oregonians as we can muster. What we're going to do now is take an excursion to hear from our representatives. We're going to start with a view from the House. We have two champions in Southern Oregon that we are proud to be able to say represent us. In the House, we have Pam Marsh, who's been there, since 2016, Pam?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so Pam's sort of veteran now, a senior. She's in House leadership now. What we're going to do is ask Pam, and we are anticipating Jeff will be joining us shortly, a question, and then we're giving Pam, I think, about 10 minutes to wax lyrically on her perspective from the House chamber. So the question that I have posed, Pam, this is not something I'm springing on her. I did share this with her earlier. How best to ensure forward progress continues beyond this governor's tenure, and how can we, your constituents, help? So I'm throwing the baton to Pam for a 10-minute excursion. Take it away, Pam. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Alan and Caren, for that wonderful summary of what happened with the governor's executive order. Just to recap, it was an exciting and then extremely disappointing short session, as well as the long session before that. Although we did some important work in 2019, we failed at the last minute to be able to pass House Bill 2020 as a result of the Republican walkout. And unfortunately, much of that was repeated in 2020. We got a walkout double time in 2020 with a walkout of the state Senate, as well as a walkout of my colleagues in the House. In walked Governor Kate Brown, as she had told people she would do, with an executive order that I think was as strong as any of us could have expected. It does fall short of cap and trade in that an executive order is really what I would describe much more as a whack-a-mole approach. Really, essentially, we're sending DEQ out to do direct regulation of entities. And a cap and invest program is much more artful. Under a cap and invest, you have the opportunity to really work with those industries to help them with support of innovation, to help them actually make the system work for them, to have a very clear picture of what's ahead. And you don't have that with whack-a-mole. Whack-a-mole is just here's the standards and we expect behavior. It may be over time that individuals who are observing the new realm actually look much more favorably on cap and trade. And in the long term, there may be an opportunity for us to come back to something of a cap and trade system. But certainly I don't expect that in 2021. That said, I'm extremely pleased with the governor's executive order and look forward to implementing it in the next session. So what's going to happen next? Well, first, I don't think you can let go of the idea that we have, and I'm just going to take a little detour here to the federal level, an election coming up in November, where it is possible that we'll see a significant change in the national administration, as well as perhaps control of the Senate. We've got a U.S. Green New Deal sitting out there waiting to be picked up, and I think that we could make a good case that coronavirus and our infrastructure all the more important and meaningful in the years to come. So that's what I'm mostly holding out for hope, that we get a significant change on the national level, and then Oregon will be very happy to fall in line with that. If that does not happen, there's still lots of possibilities here on the state level. Some of you are familiar with the state New Green Deal that was put together, promoted by a number of organizations in the past year, and it parallels in many ways the National Green New Deal, although it's more specific to us in Oregon. We are getting, so far by election results, some new members of the House. They are younger. They may be more progressive than the individuals who are leaving. So I think the door is open in the Oregon legislature to some pretty broad and robust climate legislation. Now we still got to bring along the Senate, and that's the job of my colleague, Senator Golden, who will follow my comments. But the elections are shaping up very nicely in terms of what we might be able to accomplish in the Oregon legislature. Now, what I don't think we will do next year, that is in 2021, is initiate cap and trade. It's too soon. We need to set that aside, and we need to start talking about climate policy in a much more broad sense, not associated with a specific piece of legislation or a specific policy, because we beat that one to death right now. And so I think it is appropriate to set it aside and start really focusing on the legislation that we can pass in the legislature that will start to essentially be the pillars of the governor's executive order. And there's possibilities there. I think coronavirus has actually opened up the door to some good policy work, and we should take advantage of this moment. Energy efficiency is one of those areas. Now that we've all spent so much time at home, we understand that it makes sense to invest in our own homes. And I'm hearing anecdotal experience that really clearly indicates that people are thinking in this direction. So I think there's work that we can do around energy efficiency. Specifically, I've been interested in a long time at trying to figure out how we open the door to significant energy efficiencies in tenant occupied housing units. That's a whole area that's just ready to be tapped. Tremendous gains that we can make there if we can figure out how to put the programs together that actually finance those kinds of investments. This is a year where we will be looking at the Energy Trust. Those of you who buy electricity from PG&E or Pacific Power or gas from Avista, pay a 3% public purpose charge on your bills. That money goes into the Energy Trust and funds energy efficiency programs of all kinds. That program is set to expire in a few years, and people are already talking about how to renew it and what the program should look like. And I think there's an opportunity to build in even more progressive policies into the Energy Trust docket. For example, right now, Energy Trust is prohibited from funding programs that encourage fuel switching. So if you've got a natural gas heater and you'd really like to go to electricity, you can't get any particular support from Energy Trust for doing that. That's something that we should absolutely take a look at. And you can imagine why that was implemented, because there was a desire at that time to not play different energy partners against each other. But I think it's too late for that now. We need to move on. Energy Trust is also looking at some real innovative programs around replacement of manufactured homes. And so I think as we look at what Energy Trust should look like in the future, there's an opportunity to really build much more robust programs. I think you'll see some regulatory exercises at the PUC. Right now, there's a limit on how much renewable natural gas can be part of the portfolio of our natural gas. And I know Alan has some things to say about renewable natural gas that are important to hear for sure. And yet we also know that renewable natural gas is significantly better for us than the natural gas that we're otherwise getting from fracked operations. We need to look at wildfire planning within the PUC. That was something that was on the docket when we ended the session so unceremoniously in February. And certainly we know that work in the forests and wildfire preparation is fundamentally a climate-related activity. Our forests are in the state they are for multiple reasons, but it's absolutely true that climate is the factor that's out there really exacerbating conditions. And finally, I think, and this is a particular interest of mine, but I'm going to pitch it as a climate strategy. I think we have an opportunity with coronavirus to really look at building our broadband infrastructure. We know from the experience of the last few months that broadband is critical to emergency management response. We've always known it was an important business and education and healthcare sector and entertainment and communication and political organizing tool. But now we understand that it's also emergency management. And it is very much a part of our energy savings environment. Broadband is the key to adaptation and mitigation strategies. Broadband is how you are going to monitor home energy usage. It could be the way we monitor our natural resources. For example, people who are working on the state's water plan are looking at broadband as a means for really letting us know about the quantity and use of water. We know that the use of broadband technology keeps people at home and able to access many of the fundamental services like healthcare or schooling that in a much more convenient way, and also in a way, as it turns out, that keeps them from driving their cars, sometimes for miles and miles up and down the highway. So broadband is an energy efficiency tool, it's a transportation tool, and I think it's really something that we need to start thinking about on an ongoing basis as part of our the strategies we bring to the climate discussion. So those are just a few areas that I think we'll be able to work in next year. On the longer term, Alan really posed the question, what do we do after this governor? And what I'm going to assume is, and you can tell me if this answer is a little bit of a cheating, I'm going to presume that we're going to put another governor in there who is even more committed to climate work, and that we're going to get a national administration that really leads the way on this. We can't afford to go backwards. What we have to do is keep going forward in it, and as we know, in a much more aggressive way. So that's my report. Happy to take any sort of questions if we have time for that. And thank you so much again for the opportunity to be here.
Thanks very much indeed, Governor Marsh. I think you just announced.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add a word about the comment on bandwidth. Since SOCAN has been doing so much via the Zoom technology over the last few weeks, we have become very, very sensitive to the problems of poor bandwidth for those of us who live out in the country. It seems that Jeff hasn't quite managed to join us yet. So I'm going to suggest to Ellie that, and the reason for that might well be that we gave Jeff a schedule and he wasn't actually due up until 6:55. So he may be thinking he's still got about 10 minutes left before he needs to get on. So what I'm going to suggest, Ellie, would you like to come in with any questions that you've had so far? And then if and when Jeff joins us, we can jump in with his 10 minutes.
Yes, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Ellie Cosgrove, and I've been watching all of your comments and questions coming in, and we have a couple here. The first one is for Alan, and this was a question about how we can get involved with the Oregon Climate Action Plan. Do we need interested people to review and comment on these agency plans and rules?
The answer to the quick answer to that is absolutely yes. Each of the agencies should have a plan, and I gave you the list of the links to the plans that had been posted so far on the DEQ Cap and Reduce page. And each of those plans should include a discussion of exactly how that agency is promoting public input into the plan. They all, I think, have a commitment to be open and transparent. I have been engaging with the Department of Environmental Quality, and I do know that they have a deadline of June the 15th for us to get comments back to them on their first, it's about 21-page set of proposals. And that first comment is going to be on how to promote public input. So I'm certainly planning to have a look at that one and make some contributions there. And I think the same is going to be true for the other proposals that have come in. I think most of the agencies that have been charged to produce something by the 15th, they actually had something in when I looked at the page on the 23rd, and I'm guessing the other three agencies are probably not far behind. But towards the end of the program, Kathy is going to share a little more detail on how we at SOCAN are trying to set up a mechanism whereby folks in the area or across Oregon who want to get involved can get involved. And our goal is to promote as much public input as possible, especially, as I mentioned earlier, from rural Oregon. That is us. Pam, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I think, well, staying engaged with SOCAN is actually your hint number one, because you've got some terrific leadership here who's really tracking this and understands the science, which is very important. And I think that input is going to be really critical for those who have the opportunity and they want to engage deeply, should be watching this process from the very beginning and giving input. You know, I think that we also need to be looking for ways to really talk to our fellow Oregonians about issues in resiliency and the climate realm. Unfortunately, coronavirus has complicated all of our lives. But we need to get out before we had this viral experience. There were a number of groups that I know were looking at really taking a tour of Eastern Oregon, essentially over the course of the next few months, to simply sit down and talk with people outside of a specific policy, that i.e. cap and trade, about opportunities for their communities to move forward into the Green New World, to really develop sustainability. We have some great examples out there. Lake County, many of you are familiar with, is close to 100% renewable energy. But unfortunately, cap and trade really became damaged goods. Now we need to set cap and trade aside and figure out ways to have meaningful conversations with people so that they can begin to see themselves as having a role as the world changes. So on the bigger, specific to engagement with the DEQ, by all means, read the material, give input. But on a larger, more global basis, let's start thinking about how we can put together those conversations in non-threatening ways that really start to engage people who have been disaffected by the process over the past couple of years.
Thanks, Pam.
Great. Another question about these agencies' plans. Are these agencies' plans going to provide budgetary cost estimates? And is there a commitment from the governor to protect resources to implement the plans while budgets are cut elsewhere?
I'm sorry, is there I didn't quite catch the end of the question, Ellie. Is there a commitment from the governor?
To protect resources to implement those plans while budgets are being cut elsewhere.
I don't think I can answer that question because I'd have to have the governor here to do a decent job there. All I can say is that the agencies are supposed to be having a series of activities in which they engage the public through either serving on review committees, advisory committees, or through public hearings. So the public should be getting a considerable amount of input into what the rules are as they're being developed. But I can't speak to what extent the governor is going to be looking at budgetary issues. I imagine, being the governor, that's one thing that she absolutely is going to have to be doing in this time of COVID. Pam, any thoughts?
Well, it's a really good question because we are, as a state, looking at, in this biennium, we heard last week a $2.7 billion deficit or revenue loss, which translates, when all is said and done, to about $900 million cut in the general fund budget. Now, fortunately, the $5 million allocation that was made by the emergency board the day after the governor's executive order, it should take care of things for the coming year. It should support DEQ and the staff that's now been hired to do this work. And it's a really big question, what kind of resources will be needed in the next biennium or the biennium after that. And so people standing up and continuing to make it very clear how critical this work is will just continue to be essential.
Great,
I think one of the key questions that we have to acknowledge in dealing with that is the cost of doing nothing to address global warming, climate change, is actually greater than the cost of doing something. And that's one of that's the equation that people often don't kind of get.
And we haven't, we're really at the beginning of being able to document all of those things and talk specifically about what the cost of climate is on the Oregon landscape. We started talking about that after the 2019 walkout, because we realized that people needed to see themselves in this legislation and to understand what current conditions really are, because we haven't described them well enough. And so as data starts to accumulate, we'll be able to really document with real numbers exactly what you said, what the cost of doing nothing is. I think that's critical information. It's hard to come by, but it's critical.
Okay, back to you, Ellie, I think.
All right, another question for Pam. How do our climate plans address constraints or issues related to people of color and/or vulnerable populations?
Well, as Caren described, that's a really critical part of the governor's EO, is looking at the impacts on people of color, disaffected communities. And that's actually been something that we've talked about from the very beginning. When we were working on House Bill 2020, going back a few years, we had a subcommittee that helped prepare, actually not even 2020, the bill before that. We had a subcommittee on diversity that started to look at how to make sure that the legislation was sensitive to diverse communities. That's, for as long as I've been involved, that's been a central piece of the legislation. Now, that's not to say that everybody was completely satisfied that we'd done that as well as we could. I think the issue of offsets remained controversial through the legislative history. Some people worried that offsets might mean that people who were living in areas often occupied by lower income individuals would simply have their needs overlooked with the purchase of offsets. That's a little bit in the weeds, but Alan could explain it if we wanted to go into it. So, you know, clearly, I think the COVID experience has just provided more evidence that we cannot move forward without really elevating and considering the needs of our low income and the COVID experience target those individuals in many ways, certainly for the illness and for the deaths and for the economic impacts. And as we move forward on the climate front, I think there's really an opportunity for partnerships that are perhaps more meaningful than they have been in the past to really pull along all of us to a new green world. I mean, I think that has to be it. If we've learned many lessons out of COVID, and that's one of them.
Great. And then another one for Pam. Do you think that there would be bipartisan support for expanded broadband in Oregon?
It's a really great question. I've been working on broadband in the legislature for the past several sessions. I have a specific piece of legislation that's gotten, frankly, some Republican support, but not unanimous Republican support. We are kind of engaged in a pretty significant partisan divide. That means that sometimes legislation that would even is really designed to benefit our rural and most likely Republican districts can't be supported by the individuals who represent those districts. And that was primarily about the specific funding source. Clearly, again, COVID has opened the door here. We are seeing people understand what the gaps are. We have a significant digital divide within this state. We have it nationwide, and we certainly have it within Oregon. And so I'm hopeful that we will see more collaboration across parties on the issue than we have in the past, because certainly it is, quite frankly, the Republican districts. Well, it's all we have broadband gaps all over the place, but it is the Republican districts where we really don't even have infrastructure. So there's not even the possibility of obtaining services.
Great. And that is all the questions that we have right now so far on our live video. However, if you're watching this later and after the live video is finished, please go ahead and keep commenting with any questions that you have, and we'll get you those answers. And then I'll turn things over to Kathy Conway.
So my part is to share with people different things that SOCAN is working on, and everything I'm going to share is on our website, socan.eco, then /events to see the details. We have a group on the coast called Coastal SOCAN, and their monthly meeting is tomorrow, and they will have Bill Kuhn talking about forest ecology and management under climate change and disturbance regimes. That's going to be a Zoom meeting. And so if you're interested in participating in that meeting, just send an email to bill@socan.eco and he will share the access with you so that you can join that informative meeting. The government group meets monthly. The next meeting is June 8th. Again, that's a Zoom meeting. And if you want to be added to that list so you have the access, that would be Alan at SOCAN.eco. A lot of the things that we're talking about tonight are part of the activities that the government group does work on. We also have a group called Sustaining Climate Activists. This group meets once a month. So the next meeting is June 27th. And it's a support group for people who are dealing with climate change and climate change issues, and so often feel fatigue, distress, outrage, and grief as we're dealing with those things. Facilitators are Liz Olson and Ken Devaney, and to be added to that list, which is a Zoom meeting, Liz at SOCAN.eco would get you that access. Next month, we're going to try another meeting like this. We'll see how this format works for us. The focus is on socially responsible investing. And David Savage, who has been doing this for many years, is going to be our guest. Our plan is that it will be a live stream on SOCAN's Facebook page as we have this evening. The Natural Resources Group has been meeting monthly. They have not set the date yet for their June meeting. So the contact to be on that list is David at SOCAN.eco. So you have access to that meeting in June. Our Master Climate Protector has finished for this year. It runs from February through April. But would like to call to your attention our sponsors who really helped make that course possible. This year we had 19 graduates who survived Zoom and finished the course, an excellent group. But we encourage you, if you do business with any of these groups, to mention that you recognize their sponsors of SOCAN's Master Climate Protector, and we appreciate their support. There are other SOCAN projects, and these do not have meetings set up, but there are activities going on, and the contact information is there. Climate in the Classroom works with teachers. The Media Corps, among other things, writes letters to the papers. The Natural Resources, the Water Management and Conservation Group, is working with others in the area on water issues. Oregon Legislative Districts is a project to help bring the impacts of climate change, awareness of the impacts of climate change to people that live in each of the legislative districts in Oregon. We offer presentations to different groups. There's a group, SOCAN at Mountain Meadows, who's not meeting currently, but we're hoping to get back together again. The transportation group deals with the transportation, which is such an important part of climate change. And Voices of the Valley has developed a series of interviews with people who are impacted by climate change and has plans to expand that in the future. We have a couple of announcements from other groups. So the Indigenous Land and Water Protectors webinar is this Thursday, May 28th. And for details on that, if you go to Rogue Climate's Facebook page and look at events, you'll see the details there. And Thursday is also the final in the webinar series on fire and climate. That is been organized by KS Wild, and SOCAN is one of many co-hosts for that event. 7 to 8 o'clock. You have to sign up ahead of time, and you can get the link in several places, but if you go to SOCAN's calendar, the link is there so that you have access to that webinar. And ROCPAC is Rural Oregon Climate Political Action Committee. Being a strong voice for rural Oregon on climate action. If you have interest in that, I encourage you to go to their website, and Hogan Shiro is the contact person for that. So now the challenge. The need for action grows, and Oregon's Climate Action Plan is a place where we can take some meaningful action. So what we've done is made a list of things that you can do with information. And at the bottom, you can see the socan.eco/OCAP. All this information is on that site. So we encourage you to sign up to take action. There's a short form to fill out to indicate what kinds of things you might be willing to work with others to do. Alan talked a bit about engaging in the rulemaking with the agencies. So there's a link to that page so you can see currently what each of those agencies is doing and how they're inviting and accepting information from us. Encourage people to promote the executive order in conversations with friends and family. And there's information on the website to help you do that, to help you understand more about the executive order as you talk to others. We encourage you to support the executive order with letters to the editor and letters to legislators. So information is on the website again to help you do that. Encourage local representative bodies to support action. We can connect with our city councils, our county commission, and other representative bodies and get them on board with supporting this plan and action on it. And then just to join SOCAN activities in support of the order, and we will be working on different things that will help us have a voice from rural Oregonians loud and strong. So it's time to step up. Don't assume that other people are going to do it. We need each of you to do some piece of helping us move this forward. This is a real chance for Oregon to step forward and do it in a meaningful way. If you want to take action and need more information, you can always contact Alan and he can share what he knows because he's involved in the conversations with people around the state. This is the first time we've done our monthly meeting this way, so a little different for us. A special thanks to Carmen Prophet for her technical wizardry. She is the person that makes this all happen and it's greatly appreciated. Ellie Cosgrove, who you heard asking the questions, and also Lori Kaplan have been on helping us with keeping things running smoothly. And a special thanks to Caren Caldwell and to Alan for sharing the executive order. It's not easy to wade through some of these things, so it's really helpful to have people put it in words that we can understand. And a special thanks to Pam. And Jeff has some other things going on, thought he would make it, but didn't. So if anybody has questions specifically of Jeff, if you want to add those to the Facebook comment section, we'll make sure he gets those and try to get answers to you. But thank you, Pam, for being here. We really appreciate it. So Oregon Climate Action Plan, if you want to get more information on SOCAN, socan.eco/OCAP, and then the SOCAN page, webpage where we try to keep things updated. I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. We'd appreciate feedback either in the comments section or an email. It can be to Kathy at socan.eco or Alan at socan.eco. We'd appreciate knowing how this went from your perspective. And thank you to everybody for what you're doing in this very difficult time. Thank you very much.